Civil War Roundtable member Michele Zack, as Janet phrased it, because Janet's having trouble with her voice at the moment, so I'm reading her words, is a writer and historian interested in the intersections of local and national history, ideas, and social movements. She is the current Alan Jutzi Fellow at the Huntington Library, researching Los Angeles in the run-up to the Civil War, and is the author of Altadena, Between the Wilderness and City, Seeking the Better Life in Sierra Madre, and The Lisu, Far from the Ruler. She is also the chair of the LA County's Owen Brown Gravesite Committee, and will talk about Owen's life, his legacy, and the civic battles over establishing access, restoring his gravesite, and creating a well-funded education program that will be launched in local schools this next year. Ladies and gentlemen, Michele Zack.
Can you hear me? Oh, I have to turn it on.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. And is that all right now?
Sort of somehow.
Maybe I should be on this side.
If you.
Okay, is that better? Can you hear? And thank you, Nick, for that marvelously exciting the prelude, the prologue for this, you know, and also for mentioning Mountain View Cemetery, because that also comes into my story. So I'm Michele Zack, and I want to introduce myself, but also my committee. They're not here, but it's been a very long slog, and I would like to just preface this by saying that preserving historic preservation is not for sissies. And it's not for people with short attention spans. The group that I represent, Altadena Heritage, has actually been working on this since 1989. And you know, so you're coming in at the end where we have all the good news, but this has been a real long slog. And you know, at its most prosaic, what I'm going to talk about tonight are really two things, and it has to do with two properties. One is quite well known to us because it's where Owen Brown was buried, and the other is La Vina, which was a development that was built in the 90s. And the story of how these two properties that are not even connected, but you can see one from the other, ended up kind of solving each other's problems, because they were both really problematic pieces of property. And then the big overarching thing I'd like you to think about as I talk is about memorialization. What gets memorialized, why, and who gets to decide? Because this is, I'm giving this talk at an interesting time when for the last 15 or 20 years we've been tearing down Confederate monuments. And most Civil War monuments are not in our neck of the woods. But here we have, in Altadena, we're sort of creating a monument which has a long time been a pilgrimage spot for abolitionism. And it's really a monument to the Civil War and the people who fought for it. So we're going to start with the first property. And this is our own little round top in Altadena, and this was named by Owen and Jason Brown. And those little things that look like little trees at the top there are mourners at Owen's funeral in 1889. I'm going to go over the story. I think for this group I don't need to dwell too much. I think you probably know the story of his father, John Brown, in Harpers Ferry, but I'll just go over it quickly. John Brown was the leading, most well-known white abolitionist of the 1840s and 1850s, and his last failed raid was on Harpers Ferry, Virginia, where he and a band, his army of about 20, were hoping to get rid of slavery. He was basically very religiously moved, and he believed, as did most abolitionists, that slavery was the blood sin of our country, that until we took care of it, that we could never live up to our ideals. Of course, he ended up being hanged And he took several people with him, including some of his kids. He had many children. He had about 20 and 2 wives. And some of his kids, and he moved around. He was a very restless guy, but he was the most fervent abolitionist, and he could inspire a group, a room full of people to really take up his cause. He was often called the captain or the general. So let's see. I just threw these in. A few other people died at the raid. Besides, some were executed and some were killed. And this took place in November 1859. The couple at the top, that's Winston Brown, his son, and his wife. And he was only 20 when he died. And then there's Oliver. And just to give a sense of how these people saw themselves, this is a guy, Richard Riel, poet and soldier, Secretary of State under John Brown's provisional government. So when this was something that he'd been building toward for years. I mean, throughout, bleeding Kansas and Missouri. And he had, some would say, grandiose idea of what he was doing, but he was in a captain or a general in God's army, and as he marched to the gallows, he said, "I had thought maybe we could solve this and get rid of slavery without bloodshed, but I don't believe it anymore." And in fact, most historians say that Harpers Ferry was the point after which the Civil War became it was inevitable. So, okay, Owen is one of the last survivors. If he's not the last, he's among the very last, because he was holding the horses on the other side of the river, and somehow he realized the whole thing was a failure, so he went on the run, as did about 5 or 6 others, who were all of them except for 1 or 2 were caught and either killed on the spot or were then tried and executed. So, but he lived as a fugitive on a little island on Lake Erie for about 20 years. He had a major bounty on his head. So, but then, toward the 1880s, after Pasadena was established, he decided to come out here, and he was urged to do so by a few friends, because Pasadena, you have to recall, was established after the Civil War. Why did he come here? It was all Union people, as Nick has said. Many of them were buried. They were many abolitionists, and there were very many temperance people. So this was sort of a safe place. So when he arrived in Pasadena in about 1884, 85, they had a parade. I mean, he was an instant celebrity. It's just very hard for us because to realize what a big deal John Brown was. I mean, 30 years later, they're still selling souvenirs, like at the Columbia exhibition. So Owen had been by his side. He had a long beard like his father, and he was really considered a hero by the people of Pasadena. And so Pasadena was a fairly safe place for him to come. Half of Pasadena came to his funeral. About 2,000 people turned up when he died, about 5 or 6 years after he arrived. And he was planted up, or he was buried, I should say. The fir tree was planted behind, up on Little Round Top, that first picture that I showed you. And then about, but that, if you notice, he just had a little wooden tablet. So Nathaniel Rust decided, well, that really isn't enough, and about almost 10 years later, 9 years later, he paid to have a beautiful, a stone marker made, and this is the money shot. I mean, it's very unusual in the 19th century to see a mixed race crowd. And we identified some of the people. The guy right here, this is Nathaniel Rust. This picture has been cropped, but I think this is Henry Thompson with glasses. That was his brother-in-law married to his sister Ruth. They were already in Pasadena. And Henry Thompson is often, I mean, he's most often considered to have been the hatchet man in the Potawatomi raid, where back in Bleeding, Kansas, where some of the Missouri ruffians who they said had it coming were really just murdered in cold blood. And that's as the war fervor built up, and after this, people in the South, the raid was so polarized. We think that it's polarized now. It was as much or more so then, and people were just as entrenched in their points of view. So, he had also been on the run, but he was not. He was injured pretty badly at Potawatomi, and so he was not present at the raid. So this is about 9 years later. Okay, this is the same view today, and I want you to note the trail. That's the same trail that was there, and that plays an important part in the story. And this is the view from the trail. It's very beautiful. That's looking back up El Prieto Canyon. Some of you, are you familiar with El Prieto Canyon? And it's named for Robert Owens, who was a former slave who bought his own freedom. And it just happens to be right next to Owen Brown's gravesite, and where he and his brother Jason, they homesteaded some acreage up there. Here's where they lived. This is a second cabin, and it's right at the top of, for those of you who are familiar, what's the street? It's not El Prieto. Rising Hill, thank you. That's right at the top. And where that cabin is now, there's like a 52 Dodge that's just planted in the ground that marks the spot, but it's really, could end up being a pretty interesting site to excavate. So, Owen came out and he lived with his brother Jason, and the two of them were both kind of shy. Owen probably had PTSD. Whenever they come down to Pasadena, they would pack 6 guns because Owen was still very paranoid from having been on the lam and having a price on his head. But he was a strong temperance man, and in fact, he died after he'd attended a temperance meeting in the rain in Pasadena, and apparently, gave away his last buck, or he didn't have any transportation way up to the hillside. So, but several other Brown people came to Pasadena and California. I can't identify all of these, but we know, here's some other family members who came. That's Henry Thompson, there's Ruth Thompson, that's his sister. And that's John Brown Jr. who survived. He did not get involved in the raid. And then this lady in the middle is John Brown's widow and 2 of his younger sisters. So several people did, I think they're up in Santa Clara County. But, I'm not sure where John lived. So I just, this was their kind of rustic kitchen, and I was just imagining getting ready for all these people that they prepared food there. As someone who likes to get ready for parties, I just try to imagine, in that little tiny cabin. And here's to give you some context of it was a very remote place. Okay, we're now going to come to the second piece of property that is visible from the gravesite. This is looking down at the Lavinia development, which came into being, started to be planned for in the 1880s. It was extremely controversial in Altadena because it was supposedly zoned for 120 houses, and it ended up with 274. It began as there was going to be a trail through the middle, there was going to be horse properties. Anyhow, none of that happened, and it ended up being a gated community. Yeah. So it really divided Altadena. I sort of say it was our small civil war. So this is a picture from the top, and this big green area there was originally zoned to be a school. And then fast forward, no school was built, and in the end, we did a deal. It was many committees. I've been on committees for 7 years about this, but we basically got the developer, who when there was no school, he decided that he wanted to, of course, build some more homes. But since it was zoned for a school and they had had an open space credit, we had some leverage. And, so the guy who developed this, who was public enemy #1, has ended up sort of becoming our friend and our partner. And he actually bought the Owen Brown's, the land that the gravesite is on, and is donating it to a conservancy. So these are the way the 2 pieces of land. This is what, and this is also, we're going to go back to the Giddings family. You didn't name them. The family that founded Mountain View, they came to Altadena in 1875, before Altadena existed, and they had a vineyard up in this property. Then they sold it in their Pasadena Sanitarium that existed there for like 60 or 70 years. That is the land that, in fact, Lavinia, the third now, this is the third Lavinia, where the housing is. I just thought, well, I'm sure, I remember how contentious it was. Let me just look on the internet and find a few, a few headlines about this project and how upset people were. And supervisors okay, this is from 1989. Supervisors okay project in Altadena. Housing. Lavinia Community Group opposes 272 home development on archaeological and environmental grounds. They were basically burying Indian sites, and they were, ripping out natural habitat, so people were pretty upset. And then, I just put a few. Larry Wilson, fruit of a long fight. Dream homes become nightmares. I mean, this was a big public fight all the way through the 90s. And then when he came back and wanted to build 18 in the middle of the area that was supposed to have a school, Lavinia 2 Part 1, plan for new housing as contentious as ever. So I can tell you many public meetings, people screaming, people swearing. I mean, and in this first one, back in 1989, developer Tim Cantwell whooped and clapped his hands Thursday as Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors approved the Lavinia project. This is the same Tim Cantwell, now 30 years later, who has sort of become a project, a partner on our project and bought the property for us and gave us $300,000 for educational programs. So Altadena Heritage first tried to gain historic designation in 1989, and here they're saying, because the owner of the site is threatening to remove the grave, we wish to determine landmark eligibility as soon as possible. What happened is the land is a little private freehold inside of the forest. So it's been owned and it's zoned for housing. So at any time, someone who's rich and determined enough could build their dream house up there. So there's been a series of owners, and they really didn't like that it was Owen Brown's gravesite, and as a result, the gravestone was removed several times and lost, like 3 or 4 times, and then it was always found and recovered. The last time it was lost for 10 years. So when we first tried to get historic designation, these are a couple of Adeline Ruth Craig and Eleanor Blankstead, great-grandchildren of John Brown. They came and testified. Everyone was for it. However, historic designation was denied. I regret to inform you the Commission did not recommend registration. The point criteria states that an individual must have a profound influence on the history of the local area. The primary emphasis should be the site or sites of achievement of the individual, not his birthplace, death place, or grave site. This isn't just LA County. It's very hard to get grave sites designated for that reason, but in this case, Owen really did do very important things in coming to Pasadena. He galvanized, all of the union supporters. He became, in his lifetime, it became a pilgrimage spot. So, however, turned down. So other things happened along the way. people not only who owned the land, but people who didn't really like anyone hiking by the land tried to block trail access. So there was a there were more than one lawsuit. I won't go into all of them, but this was a lawsuit, and some of you recognize Paul Ayers, who last night was up in Altadena giving a talk. And there's Marietta on the far side. She has been a trail advocate. There's me, this is, you know, how many years ago. And all these different people from the Meadows who've gotten together and sued the people who tried to block access along that very road that you've seen in a couple of slides. So it was a great triumph that access was, it was adjudicated. However, at that time, the gravestone was missing. So, I mean, it just seemed like it was impossible that any of this was all going to come together. Now, this might seem like a non sequitur, but this is John Brown, and it's by the noted black artist Charles White, who happened to live in the Meadows. And he is a very big deal. I attended New York Museum of Modern Art. He had a one-man show. It was like 4 rooms, 100 drawings. The only white guy that Charles White ever did a portrait of was John Brown. And he ended up living right below Owen Brown's gravesite. He moved to the Meadows in the 1960s with his mixed-race family. Which was kind of a big deal at the time. And he planted several pine trees up and down, you know, from the gravesite to behind where his house is. So there's so many circles that have been closed, so many kind of coincidences. So, and keep an eye on that little chubby boy, because when he grows up, he has a big part in our story. The last time the gravestone was lost, it was lost for 10 years, and it was found by Ian White. And it was after a storm. Usually they just push the gravestone down one side, and it was found a year or two later. In this case, someone, probably the property owner, had taken a winch and pulled it over to the east side, and it was missing and buried it. It was missing for 10 years. Ian White found it one day after a storm, a little bit of it sticking out. And he's a very, and so he made a copy of it, and we put it in Altadena Triangle Park. At this point, Ian said, I'm not putting it back up there until we have a friendly owner on that property, because look at it, it's gone missing 3 or 4 times, and it will surely go missing again. And I mean, who owned that piece of history? But no one was going to really fight with Ian White. And it seemed quite sensible. You know, why would you put it back and it could disappear, especially because it had been missing for 10 years at this point. And he found it in 2017. He made a replica. Here's the replica sitting in my dining room. And then we put it up at Triangle Park just to keep the story alive. Because at that time, frankly, it was still a total pipe dream that we would ever have a friendly owner, that we would ever own the property, that we would ever, you know, have the money to do what we now have the money to do. And so you can see that the picture you recognize there. And this is that little boy grown up. And next to him is Tim Cantwell, the guy who was whooping and hollering and so happy when he got his approval for his housing development, who is now, you know, has to come back, not exactly cap in hand, but he has to come back to the county in order to get permission to build 18 homes on a school site. He needed a zone change. So he has gone on this incredible personal journey where even before he had the permission, he went ahead and bought the site for us, the 6 acres. And we had a committee on the town council. There's Sandy, some of you recognize that, Sandy Thomas and me. There's Ian growing up. I apologize for being in a lot of these pictures. I thought I should not use these pictures, but I happen to have been around at many ceremonial occasions. Otherwise, you know, this has basically been, you know, a very prosaic, long, bureaucratic thing. We wouldn't have any pictures of it. And then in 2019, the Board of Supervisors pass our plan that the town council worked out, and it all, you know, it all became, you know, what was going to happen. And so Ian White, who was relentlessly holding on and hiding the gravestone, wouldn't tell anyone where it was. Once the Board of Supervisors had passed, you know, the plan that included that, you know, he was going to give money and that he was going to, you know, we had 4 conditions. So he gave the gravestone back, and this is its triumphant return to that thing that weighs over 500 pounds. Let's see. And here they are. And this is the story of where we got it back in the right place. Of course, it had been moved so many times that nobody knew exactly where it was supposed to be. And here Paul Ayres comes back into the story. Besides being a gifted lawyer, one of his specialties, a man of all trades, is in forensic photography. So he could look and line up all these old pictures of the various, you know, the ridge lines, because the ridge lines don't change. Everything else changes, but the ridge lines change for it, and figure out from looking at, you know, 15 or 20 pictures and some aerials exactly where the gravesite was. The problem was the hillside had eroded. So Owen's head would have been going downhill. So we had to build a small retaining wall, and this time it was put in with a lot of steel and a lot of cement, and we think it's not going anywhere now. And here's Martin Luther King Day, you know, 15 or 20 years after that first shot. And we now have this public place and this piece of land, instead of you know, 6 acres encircled in a gated community, the community has gained this wonderful historic site. And we, you know, every chance we get, we go up there and someone gives a talk or recites something. Nick has been up there. Several, you know, local historians have come up and given talks. And so we're well on our way now. The interesting thing, again, about Tim Cantwell, he still does not have his approval from the county to build his 18 houses. However, he went ahead and he's funded our committee, and now, you know, now we're rooting for him with the county.
That's funny.
And this is sort of what it looks like now. And next week we're going to be getting, we're keeping the site very simple. We don't want it to be any kind of a Disneyland, no busloads of people. I mean, it's a hike to get up there. It's not too long, but it's quite steep as anyone. How many in the room have been up there? Oh, lots of you. Okay, so you know. And we've added this. It would be easy if you're walking along El Prieto Trail to miss the gravesite, because you have to turn it sort of back over your shoulder to the little zigzag up to the top of Little Round Top. And then for people who don't want to hike, we added this 5-foot by 3-foot bronze plaque, and it's at Mountain View Mausoleum. You think, well, why Mountain View Mausoleum? It's the, as Nick referred, it is the first. It's been run by the same family, and that is the Giddings family, and by Joshua Reed Giddings. I don't know, I know you're pretty good history buffs here, but he is the one who broke the gag order on discussing slavery in the House of Representatives. So he was an ardent abolitionist. He was, I think, the grandfather or the uncle of Levi Giddings, who came out here and to Pasadena and Altadena and established this graveyard. And then about 40 years later, they bought the mausoleum across the street, and that's where this is. So he's and his family, they're very happy, you know, and very proud of their legacy. And so we wanted, you know, we've been looking for community partners. We're working with PUSD. We're making a film. And we approached him and said, oh, you know, we'd love to maybe, you know, you've got a connection. connection here. Maybe we could have some program. And he just immediately, like a light bulb went up in his head, and he said, let's go over to the mausoleum, and wouldn't you like to put up, and we'll do it at our cost. I mean, you won't have to, so something that would normally cost, $30,000 or $40,000, they did it for $5,000. And then this is pretty interesting because these are two entities, the county sued Tim Campbell, and now they're friends and kind of working together. So persistence does pay off. Some of you will recognize there's Paul Ayers. Bill Deverell is our project historian. Look at, there's Tim, he's getting like more hippie-like every year. Diane Markison's on the committee. She's in the town council. She's been working and slogging away at this for years. And then there's our supervisor and me, and then John Burton, who's a civil rights lawyer, and Marietta Cruels. So that's the story of two places. I really obviously summarize, but if you have any, there's so much that I left out, and if you have any questions, I'd be very happy to take them. Let's see. Yes?
I found a picture of Owen Brown on Echo Mountain, and he's just sitting there looking out onto the cityscape. And I'm just curious if he knew Thaddeus Lowe. They would have been connected through the Union, I guess. Any history about them connecting?
Sorry, the connection?
Between Thaddeus Lowe and Owen Brown.
Oh, well, what happened is after Owen died, his brother Jason worked on the railroad. He worked for Thaddeus Lowe.
Oh.
Now, Jason had a shorter beard. You've seen some pictures of him. They look quite a bit of, and he was a very shy and retiring fellow. He never took part in any of the abolitionist activities.
Okay.
And in fact, the Brown brothers, they were looking at Mount Lowe and trying to get that named Brown Mountain, but Lowe beat him to the punch, and he brought this wonderful railway. So, so then they found a lesser mountain, which they had named Brown Mountain. But the connection is that Jason worked for him. After Owen died, he made a zoo up there. He worked, had various jobs, and then he ended up returning back east, though, and he died back east.
Okay, it's probably Jason then.
That would be Jason, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Because Owen was already dead by the time because he died in 1889, and Lowe started work right around then, but more like in 1890. He opened the first part, like up to the incline, I think, 1893. But
Okay.
very kind of close time proximity. Yes?
I was really unaware that Pasadena connection with the Browns until I read the novel Cloud Splitter way back.
Cloud Splitter, I recommend that. That
I
is
really enjoyed that, but how did Owen come to terms with his dad?
well, Cloud Splitter, for those of
What did he?
well, he was his father's right-hand man. And for those, the question is about the novel. You have to keep remembering this is a novel by Russell Banks, Cloud Splitter, and it's told from Owen's point of view. And for those of you who know Russell Banks, he really explores family dynamics, especially difficult father-son relationships. And I think I'm not saying anything that anyone could disagree. Owen Brown was John Brown was a difficult man to have for your father. And you either kind of got with his program or you didn't. And if you didn't, and if you weren't religious, and if you didn't become an abolitionist, he just was very disappointed. I mean, he didn't ever try to, he was a brilliant guy and a tactician. He knew he couldn't make his family come along, but several of them did. And Russell Banks' exploration of their relationship, I just kept feeling it was real. I had to keep telling myself it was a novel because it's beautifully researched. But there's a few things. I don't think that that Owen and John went to Europe to study the battlefields of, Napoleon, to plan their battle against, slavery in the United States. I tried to look it up. I thought, did they? I didn't know that, but I couldn't find any reference. Any other questions? Yes.
What is it like to research at Huntington Library?
Oh, it's a lot of fun. I have been looking at the 1850s. But it's varied now. I've been a reader there for 20 years, ever since I did the Altadena book. So I would say that it used to be more fun, because now everything is digitized, and everything you need to get a seat assignment, and you need to look all through all of these digital archives, and there's not as much browsing as there used to be. And often when you're browsing through card catalogs and things, you come up with something that's next to the card or behind it. And but it's still a wonderful, I feel like it's a complete felicitous. I didn't ever think that I would get a fellowship there, because I'm not a PhD historian. But they have this, the Alan Jutzi is for non-traditional scholars, so I fit that. But there's so much there. Yes?
Can you tell us about the educational effort that has been funded?
Okay, I would love to. So far, the main thing we're trying to do is teach teachers about this local history so that they can include it in the curriculum of local students. And I worked on the Teaching American History grant for 9 years, and the Huntington was our partner with PUSD. So we're basically taking that model, and so the first thing we're doing, we're making a film that will tell this whole story, not so much of the real estate side of it, but the history side of it. And we're making a film, one that will be a shorter one for younger kids, and one for middle school, and one for high school, using the state standards for what the teachers have to teach anyhow. So we know from experience, teachers don't like all these more work piled onto them. But if you are able to come up with a curriculum that absolutely zeroes in on what they need to teach anyhow, then you can be really, you're going to be helpful. So what we're going to do, that film is being produced now, and then we're going to have, you have to pay teachers to take what's called PD, professional development. So that's a lot of our money is going to go toward paying teachers, not that much, we'll have a 3-part training. They'll probably get $100 for each Saturday morning, and they'll get great scholars. Bill Deverell, some other scholars are going to come in, and we're creating a library of images, and they're going to make lesson plans that fit exactly at their grade level. So, and then we're going to use the film to anchor that. And then the teachers are going to go into their classrooms, and they'll also have a film to use and to enthuse the kids about this history in their own backyard, and help the Civil War, over there somewhere else, nothing to do with us. It's going to kind of tie it all in. That is the expectation. So thank you for that question. I could go on about that. That's very exciting. And PUSD has totally stepped up. I'm very happy. They've been funding a curriculum specialist to work for us, and she did all the research so that we cover what needs to be covered. Okay, if there are no more questions, oh yeah, there's one back there.
I'm just curious if Owen had any connection with the GIR and the Pasadena.
I don't know that. I know he was a huge temperance guy, but I don't know. Pasadena was founded after the Civil War by all these people who really, as the un-Los Angeles, they really had something to prove. They wanted to prove civilization was possible in the West, because Los Angeles, was full of saloons and brothels. They could not keep their school open, but they maintained a very steady ratio of one bar for every 200 residents. So it was, you know, it was the most violent city in the West, more extrajudicial hangings and lynchings. So it was really not the kind of place that the very genteel, often sick, temperance, you know, cultured sort of person who established Pasadena, you know, they wanted to distance themselves from that. So there were a lot of cultural, you know, the Grand Army of the Republic. I mean, you know, he was not a veteran though.
No.
So he might not, I mean, they might have been sticklers for who could join. I don't know, is the honest answer.
I know a little bit about that. He was a guest at some of their events,
Oh,
but he was not permitted to be a member because of the rules of the organization. So, but the problem is he died before the organization was really big here in Pasadena.
yeah.
So for small events though, there's indication that he was invited to be part of their Memorial Day things, which were still very small back with the museum.
Yeah, Pasadena was very proud of its whole union connection, and a lot of temperance people, a lot of abolitionists, a lot of women's rights. So they, you know, these were kind of shy guys, but people would come up and visit them. I mean, there was a steady stream, and we have a real strong record of newspaper articles about, you know, coming up to visit the hermit Brown boys, you know, and they were usually polite. But Jason and Owen really wanted to create a memorial to their father. They didn't want this history to be lost. And I mean, you could say it was a tourist attraction, but they came here just as a regional culture was forming. And people coming out here, you know, needed things to do. And so this was one thing. This was going to be like to come up and have a memorial to their father. That's what he was planning. But then he died, and it ended up kind of being a memorial to him, kind of standing in for his father and as one of the last survivors of Harpers Ferry. So, no more questions? Oh, there's one back there.
So where's the father?
Last one. Pardon?
Where is John Brown buried?
John Brown is back in Alba, New York, I think. He's in the family, and there was a move to try to take Owen's bones back there too. And different, I mean, there are John Brown societies everywhere where the Brown family, and they were a very peripatetic family. I mean, they lived in Kansas, they lived in Ohio, they lived in New York, they lived in Massachusetts. So practically every place that they touch has a John Brown society, and you know, and they have John Brown impersonators, and so they wanted his bones. But somehow, you know, luckily for us, they stayed here, so we have a piece of this history. So